as Roy McGee says, he believes that God was forging relationships that he could later use. Father Reed, similarly, at the time was establishing relationships with the members of his church, speaking with them, gaining their trust, gaining their respect. They were both figures of authority at the local level in their communities. Father Reed really explains the way that they were able to forge these relationships of trust by the fact that they were really able to see the multiple identities that these individuals have. So even though Father Reed would look out at his congregation and see that members of the IRA were also members of his church, these individuals who've been associated with violence are also parents. They're also sons and their daughters, and they're wage earners, and they're members of his church. And so through this process, they really saw the humanity of these individuals, and were able to establish that trust and forge these relationships, and over the years bring these different individuals together who had never met before, who had never sat face to face before on both sides of the conflict. It's interesting because in both of their cases, they were very much behind the scenes. Some people didn't even know their names. For Father Reed, he was oftentimes just referred to as the priest, or the saggart, which is an Irish word for priest. He was just someone who was seen ducking in and out of the homes of paramilitary leaders and then government offices and the offices of political parties and so on. But what he was doing was passing messages on from one to another and mediating and negotiating, and over the years generating ideas and position papers, which eventually led to the IRA ceasefires on Father Reed's side, and then the UVF ceasefires on Reverend McGee's side, and eventually the Good Friday Agreement. In fact, some of the ideas that they generated were later in the Declaration of Peace and then in the Good Friday Agreement. Many of the peacemakers, or really all of the peacemakers in this book, were afforded a similar level of trust and a sense of credibility among their community. And sometimes they were even known to demand this trust and this respect. A really interesting story is from Friar Ivo Markovic's case study in the book. He's a Bosnian Croat Franciscan, and he joined the Franciscan seminary before the war in Bosnia started in the seminaries in Sarajevo. But in July 1992, he was there when the fighting erupted between the Bosniak Muslims and the Croats. And he and his fellow Franciscans appealed to the politicians to try to quell the violence before it spiraled out of control. But it wasn't successful. The politicians weren't successful in doing that. So Friar Ivo and his fellow Franciscans decided to become active. And one particularly tense day, when the Croat army was on one side and the Bosniak army on another side, literally facing each other in a field, Friar Ivo and some of his fellow Franciscans decided to walk through that line from a Croat village to a Muslim village to appeal to the imam there and ask for his help in trying to bring the local commanders together and get them to agree to stop their armies from escalating the violence. As they were walking through this line between the two groups of soldiers, the soldiers were constantly challenging them and constantly threatening them. And I could only imagine what a tense situation this was. And at one point, one of the soldiers actually pointed his gun at Friar Ivo and said, "Stop or I will shoot." And Friar Ivo was particularly angry and frustrated at this time, and he ran up to the guy and he's like, "Are you crazy? You're going to shoot me, you idiot?" And he actually used those words, and he pointed at the clothing he was wearing, which clearly it was a Franciscan habit, so clearly identifying himself as a religious leader. And the guy put his gun down, as did all the other soldiers on the two sides, and some of the soldiers actually followed them right into the village. And so they were able to go in, and once they got in, they saw that it was quite chaotic. There was a rain of bullets, people screaming and running and hiding, and families trying to escape. And they made their way to the imam and asked for his help, and the imam agreed, and they even offered to keep one of the Franciscans there while they went to the other side, and he said, no, no, we're not going to have any hostages, let's do this together. And so they decided to go to a local cafe and meet the two commanders there, and were able to negotiate an agreement in which the two local armies would not participate in the fighting. And later on, the region was overrun by troops, but these particular armies did not participate in the fighting because of their agreement with Friar Ivo and the imam in the Muslim village. Another quality that we noticed right away that sets these peacemakers apart is on a more intimate personal level. I guess it's a more inner quality, and that's that they do see, perhaps from their religious viewpoint, they do see the humanity in all, and they have this intolerance to injustice, which continues to fuel their work and sustain them. They carry a certain emotional intelligence, a deep personal awareness, capacity for self-reflection, and a capacity to forgive. I think one thing that's so key to remember about these peacemakers is that they themselves are in the communities, they themselves are affected by the violence around them, and so they've seen and experienced the suffering firsthand. Friar Ivo, who is just on the screen, lost his father in the conflict, many of his relatives, I think over 50 people in his neighborhood. And one day, when he found out about that, all he could think about was revenge. He very seriously considered going to the community and getting involved in the fighting. And then he stopped and said, no, this is not the calling of my faith. This is not what my religion tells me to do. And I need to be involved in trying to bring peace. And so they really become walking examples of forgiveness and the capacity to forgive for their community members as well. Certainly, religion is a resource that continues to sustain them and sustain their long-term commitment to peace. They're there to stay. And in many ways, they see peacemaking as their religious calling. It's for those of the peacemakers who are Christian, they see it as following the footsteps of Jesus Christ, or for their Muslim colleagues, following the footsteps of Prophet Muhammad. And the fact that religion is so deeply personal as it is social for them, that's one of the reasons why we decided to focus on religious individuals. There isn't a whole lot of literature out there on religion and its role in conflict resolution, but what is out there and what's emerging happens to focus more on the role of religious institutions, so the role of the church, for example. And we decided to focus on religious individuals because sometimes, and it is the case for some of the stories here, their religious institutions didn't necessarily support the work that they were doing. And so this was coming, their peacemaking was coming from their own interpretations of what their religious teachings tell them to do and what their religious teachings say about peace and being involved in social justice. Drawing from their religious beliefs, they've crafted a series of highly effective peacemaking techniques that can be learned and studied and implemented by others. From their stories, we really do see the proof that local religious leaders can play a very urgently needed role right now. As we analyzed their stories and methods, we saw that there's a variety of ways in which religious resources have been used in a very practical way in conflict resolution. And what's been very interesting is that although there is such diversity in the types of techniques they use, they're derived from very different religious beliefs and very different cultural backgrounds, there are still a lot of similarities in the types of works that they do and the methodologies they use. And we've seen that peacemakers on very opposite corners of the world, operating in very, very different contexts, very different conflict situations, even different religions, are using very similar methods. And so that's been very interesting, and that speaks to the fact that these techniques are adaptable and they can be used in other conflict situations. I'll just briefly touch on some of these techniques and give you some examples of the stories, and then there will be some time for discussion afterwards. The first one is using religious texts, and the example I want to tell you about is our peacemaker Sakina Yaqubi in Afghanistan. She, in 1995, the same year that the Taliban came into power, she founded the Afghan Institute of Learning. This, under